I never thought a single text could change everything. I wasn't expecting fireworks or drama. I thought our marriage had settled into its comfortable rhythm. I'm Adrian, 38, married to Celeste for 12 years. We met at a mutual friend's gallery opening. She was radiant, confident, magnetic. I was quieter, worked in architecture, had my own apartment, paid my bills, and loved details. She said she liked my stability, my ability to keep life orderly. For the first 5 years, everything felt effortless. We laughed, traveled, shared nights with movies and quiet talks. There was a spark I thought would last forever. Then, around year 6, subtle shifts started creeping in. Celeste became distant, not in a loud, obvious way, but in quiet moments that mattered. She stopped laughing at my jokes, not because they weren't funny, but because she wasn't listening. She'd come home exhausted, collapsing onto the sofa with her phone, scrolling endlessly. I tried to interpret it generously: work stress, fatigue, life pressure. I cooked dinners, cleaned, tried to bring warmth back, hoping love would circle back to us. But it didn't. The kisses became side hugs. The small touches became fleeting acknowledgments. And the intimacy that once defined our marriage turned into absence. I raised it once gently. "I miss us," I said. She smiled faintly, almost dismissively. "I've just been busy," she replied, as if the years of emotional absence could be masked by a casual excuse. That moment was the start of a slow erosion. I kept trying, because that's what I believed marriage required: patience, understanding, loyalty. I didn't fight, didn't shout, didn't demand attention. I hoped my presence alone would remind her of our connection. But each attempt was met with more distance, more subtle rejections, until one evening, it came in the form of a text that would fracture everything. "Adrian, I went on a trip with my ex. I couldn't say no. I'll miss you." I read it 3 times, each time hoping the words would rearrange themselves into a mistake, a joke, a misunderstanding. But the text remained the same: crisp, cold, undeniable. My stomach dropped. My hands went numb. There was no immediate anger, only a strange, quiet disbelief. I remember staring at my phone, tracing the cracks on my desk with my finger, listening to the muted hum of our home, suddenly deafening in its silence. Celeste didn't call. She didn't explain. She didn't even anticipate my reaction. There was no screaming, no pleading, no negotiation. There was just the text, just the truth she didn't want to say out loud, but had no problem sending electronically. I knew in that moment that what had been slowly dying in our marriage, attention, desire, emotional reciprocity, was now fully gone. I hadn't noticed the death of our closeness because I had been blind, holding on to routines, traditions, my version of loyalty. But this text was a revelation, a definitive statement of reality. She had already chosen someone else. I didn't respond immediately. I put the phone down, went to the living room, and sat on the couch, letting the words echo in my mind. I realized that love wasn't being denied me because I had failed. It was being redirected elsewhere. The nights of quiet rejections, the small withdrawals, all the subtle emotional coldness, none of it was about me. It was about her. The next morning, I decided to process this the only way I could, with quiet clarity. I packed a small bag, clothes, my laptop, a few essentials. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't try to rationalize. I left the house as calmly as possible, feeling a strange liberation in the act of finally stepping out of a life that had become a slow form of emotional suffocation. As I drove to my friend Callum's house, I reflected on the subtle patterns I had ignored for so long. The evenings spent with her phone instead of conversation, the holidays planned around her friends rather than us, the small dismissals of my efforts. Each one now felt like a signpost I had missed, and I realized it wasn't about fixing her. It was about reclaiming myself. I stayed at Callum's that night, lying on his spare couch, the house silent except for the soft tick of the clock. My mind raced, not in anger, but in clarity. I wasn't hurt because of what she had done. I was hurt because I had failed to see the truth earlier. The text was brutal, yes, but it also freed me from pretending, from waiting for someone who had already moved on. The following days were measured. I didn't send messages, didn't demand explanations, didn't linger on guilt. I focused on small things: my work, my routines, the restoration of my own emotional balance. I checked in with my lawyer only for practical advice, not confrontation. The key was maintaining composure, control, dignity, the very things I had lost sight of in my attempts to save what was never mine to hold anymore. In that calm, I realized the contrast framing that had dominated our lives. What had been vibrant love had turned into habitual tolerance. Warmth had become indifference. Closeness had become estrangement. And yet, the world outside remained steady, indifferent, moving along as if my private heartbreak was insignificant. That was the paradox of the moment, the quiet devastation and the silent, unacknowledged continuity of life. I began to see her in moments of interaction with a new lens, not with jealousy, not with anger, but with detached observation. Celeste wasn't cruel. She was simply acting on her desires, choices, and impulses, as any human does. My role was no longer to chase, persuade, or convince her of my worth. It was to witness, accept, and step forward. 1 week later, she texted again. Short, tentative. Something about hoping I was okay, a faint attempt at connection. But I had changed. The clarity I had gained in the first text had solidified. I replied once, succinctly, calmly, "I'm doing well. I hope you are too." And then I let it be. No follow-up, no reasoning, no entanglement. The power of the narrative had shifted. It was no longer hers to direct. By the end of that month, I was living independently, moving through my days with an odd sense of liberation. The initial pain dulled into acceptance. The shock transformed into perspective. I had learned something essential. Love cannot be forced, loyalty cannot be demanded, and respect is earned, not borrowed. The quiet acknowledgement of this truth, without dramatics, without confrontation, without revenge, was perhaps the most profound victory of all. Looking back, I understand that the text from Celeste was not just a betrayal. It was an unveiling. It revealed the patterns I had ignored, the emotional gaps I had tolerated, and the reality I had refused to see. And while it hurt, it also offered the rarest of gifts, the clarity to leave behind what was no longer healthy and embrace a life of self-respect, autonomy, and quiet resilience. I didn't walk away in anger. I didn't make a scene. I simply chose myself. And in that choice, I found a peace that had eluded me for years, a calm that was sharper than any fireworks, deeper than any words, and more enduring than any fleeting passion.